My name is Stephen Forde. That's a Norwegianized mispronunciation of my name. And I'm at the University of North Texas. So, let's see if I can pare this down to a very brief presentation so that we can have time for questions. My paper really deals with two separate but related fields. Issues. One is dealing with a different understanding of what honor and how honor fits into liberalism, or of what liberalism is, taking my cue from Francis Fukuyama / Hegel in the infamous end of history kind of thesis. And the second, then, I dip into evolutionary theory in order to, I think, bolster more or less the same understanding of what makes liberalism tick, and also, of course, what its pathologies are. All right, so liberalism, and I begin talking about Thomas Hobbes, and so we've got our briefing on Hobbes today. Views honor mostly as just a reflection of self-interest, survival, et cetera, et cetera. It's the struggle for survival that leads people to care about honor. Liberalism is the regime that is devoted to preservation of interests above all, and so therefore liberalism has advanced and triumphed in the world today because it caters to people's self-interest. Fukuyama, drawing on Kojève and Hegel, makes, I think, a very interesting argument that obviously liberalism its success is due largely to the material prosperity that it brings and the liberty and all the rest of that. However, what really fuels it in some sense is instead what I would see as a kind of correlate to honor, which is recognition. Fukuyama says, okay, what is it? Now, all these people are risking their lives, fighting and dying, starting at least with 1776, for material prosperity? I don't think so. There's something else going on here, and so what he argues is that really what people are fighting for is recognition. The idea that I must be recognized as an equally dignified human being, because the system basically holds me in contempt, like that Tunisian fruit vendor who set himself aflame and started the whole Arab Spring thing just because of the way that he saw, the system essentially having contempt for him and for others. So, to the extent that that's true, and then of course in the Declaration of Independence they end with appealing to their sacred honor, which is not simply self-interest. And so the argument actually that Hegel makes, of course, is that really the modern liberal regime that he regarded as the end of history is the end of history partly because it is the first regime that really grants equal recognition to all human beings as rational, dignified creatures. And so the end of history is the end of history just because, beginning with the master-slave thing at the very beginning of history and the conflicts and these honor cultures and the ludic warfare and all this other stuff was kind of groping towards, I guess, this egalitarian paradise that we're in, which is a regime really of mutual recognition. And so this makes more sense. I find the argument plausible that in a way this makes more sense as an account of why liberalism is triumphing, why people are willing to fight and die for it in this way. I don't know if we should call it recognitionism instead of liberalism or something like that. And of course, freedom is prized not simply so that I may go out and find a better paying job, but because it actually reflects my equal dignity as a human person. So, Fukuyama, I believe, coins this term isothymia, as the Greek originated word as the basis of this liberal accommodation, which is to say, everyone, thumos is just one of the three parts of the soul in Plato's Republic, and it's the kind of spirited part, the athletic part, right? The competitive, honor-seeking, I guess. And, so megalothumia is, the people who just want it all, I suppose, even including either ludic type honor or authoritarian honor. Isothumia is everyone agreeing to grant to all an equal kind of respect. And so a kind of scaling back of this thumotic desire. All right, so for Hegel, of course, this was the end of history because it's sort of this perfectly balanced, rational, system of recognition of equally rational beings, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fukuyama is actually much less sanguine in a way, partly because this thumos, this is passion. It's not reason. What people are looking for, it's a kind of passionate response to me being, it's an angry response to me being held in contempt. It's not that it's not the rationality in us so much, as well as Plato would have said, the thumotic, which is something that can be allied with reason, but not necessarily. And so even though Fukuyama is pilloried, of course, for saying that this is the end of history, but I think you have to understand that his view is actually very different from Hegel's in a number of ways. One of them is this, that this is not the perfect rational accommodation, that we're really talking about a very important and maybe very respectable human passion, this thumos. But that, of course, makes it also, in a way, kind of crazier, more unpredictable. The end of history is not a perfect accommodation of everything, and so Fukuyama, the title of the book version of his argument is The End of History and the Last Man, because he worries that, actually the end of history, which is where we are, could also issue in the last man, because isothumia involves somehow sweeping under the rug or forgetting megalothumia, the desire for truly great distinction. And so it doesn't fully satisfy all elements of human nature. And of course, to the extent that isothumia is passionate rather than rational, it can take all kinds of perverse forms. People can find almost anything honorable. I think that Dan alluded to this too. It could be chastity, it could be scalp gathering, it could be prison time if you're the honor of an inner city gang, right? So honor is actually a kind of loose cannon as a kind of basis for a regime, but so that's where we have to get around to somehow taming honor or attaching it to the right kinds of things, which Laurie Johnson and others have spent a lot of time talking about. All right, so that's the first part of my argument about Fukuyama and that liberalism is, in a way, the beating heart of liberalism, its strength is owing to something other than simply the self-interest and prosperity argument. So then, what is the actual character of this longing for honor in human nature? And so that's where I go into evolutionary theory. Because I think that, unless you're a member of the Kansas School Board, you have to admit that evolution is the truth, I'm afraid, which I've always worried, I always was very fascinated with this evolution thing, but always kind of avoided it because I feared that it would destroy what I do for a living, which is, argue about the human passions and human emotions and what's right and wrong and all these other kinds of things. But the fact is, part of evolutionary theory, obviously, is that we are descended from other life forms, and these other primates in particular. Our physiology reflects this, obviously. And to some unknown degree, our psychology is also an inheritance. There are whatever sort of natural human reflexes, like if there is a thumos there is some kind of impulse, some kind of insistence on recognition or some kind of urge for honor, that would also have to be descended from some earlier kind of form of predisposition. And so these Darwinians are, when they talk about morality, really what they're talking about, what they've come up with is basically a form of the moral sentiments theory, right? That human morality is a series, based on a series of intuitions or passions whose protoforms can be seen in other species, in particular our closest relatives. And so, for example, They spend a lot of time talking about and observing chimpanzees who don't seem to have the ludic honor. Chimpanzee society, well, chimpanzees display what looks kind of like indignation, when they've been slighted. I mean, it's very hard to know to interpret in human terms. Various forms of sympathy, ambition for sure, at least among all male chimpanzees. They all want to be alpha, apparently, all of them. Okay, so it seems that the human love of honor somehow is a modified form of that. So what can we make of this? Well, first of all, it seems to be kind of bad news because all of the primates who are our closest relatives are extremely authoritarian in their social structures. I mean, they're all mostly very social creatures, except for the bonobos. It's a qualified exception. They're extremely authoritarian. Most of human history, of course, has been extremely authoritarian. So this leads some to argue, of course, we are, by nature, a very authoritarian species, and we find these pecking orders, and even if we're set out on an equal footing, we immediately sort of start sorting ourselves into rank orders and competing over this and that. Okay, so we are just, the alpha, and just another one of these alpha-type species. But if you look at what seems to have been the way of life of early humans, prehistoric humans, and to the extent that this can be inferred from archaeological evidence, and then, of course, from studying the very few simple hunter-gatherer type societies that still exist, it's remarkably egalitarian. These societies are small, typically about the size of a chimpanzee band, but they really don't have an alpha. It's remarkably consensual basis, and to the extent that you can say our nature can be seen in its pristine form, this would seem to be it. So we have our ancestors are extremely authoritarian. Most of our history is very authoritarian, but the intervening couple of 100,000 years when we actually evolved into we got the genome we have, we're remarkably egalitarian somehow. Okay, so I draw on a particular anthropologist named Christopher Bohm, who's come up with this account, I think, that makes a lot of sense of how do we explain this? These societies, it turns out, as I said, nobody is allowed to be alpha, but obviously, as we all know, that alpha ambition still is seen among humans, and so one of the institutions or protocols or norms that you see in these kinds of societies is the community is extremely vigilant against anybody's showing signs that they want to become alpha. In other words, everyone's very much it's like the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, right? The price of not having to submit to an alpha is continual vigilance, and people are warned. They're tamped down in extreme cases, but not really uncommon cases. They'll take somebody out and assassinate them. That's the enforcement, this kind of vigilante justice. Okay, so Bohm says, how do we understand this accommodation, this way of life, or this regime, I suppose we could call it, although it's not political. He wants to call it political. He actually kind of envisages it as a social contract of a kind, that here we were, this extremely authoritarian species. For a number of reasons, that way of life was not, there's a number of reasons why that kind of rigid hierarchy, it seems, it would not have worked given the way of life that humans developed as they moved out of the jungles. As I said earlier, every male chimpanzee is born with the desire to be alpha, and there's this, there is an alpha, but it's a relatively fluid situation, challenges and all the rest of that are taking place. So let us say that every male chimpanzee wants to be alpha. Of course, most of them will never be alpha, but they don't like it. I guess you could say that that's the kind of thumotic impulse, right? But obviously there's no indication in them that they somehow regard the alpha's rule as unjust or merit really playing a part in it, I don't think. So Bohm says we have to imagine a situation in which the submissives, that is all the rest of us, get together and kind of decide. The contract is, it's really like Glaucon in Book 2 of the Republic. The weak get together and say, okay, I renounce my ambition to become alpha on condition that nobody gets to be alpha. Because in that way, we each get to be as much of an alpha as we can. That is to say, sort of autonomy is actually the word that Bohm uses. And so, if that's true, it seems that the isothumia that we have, and that I guess is the basis to some degree of our regime, is really a kind of scaling back of the natural, I guess, with Socrates, we would have to say, everybody naturally wants to rule the world, except for the philosophers. But we have reached this accommodation whereby we all renounce that ambition in order to enjoy being, alpha over ourself at least, right? Not having to be submissive. And of course, what really rankles us, at least people raised in our kind of culture, is the idea of having to submit somehow. Just cannot take that. It's like the Alamo or something like that. If you try to challenge. So, this distinctively human version of the honor thing, first of all, is very much more flexible than chimpanzees. Every chimpanzee band has the same structure, the same basic authority structure, and it will never change. There is an alpha, there are challenges, but there is no possibility of, like, the non-alphas getting together and deciding to just overthrow the alpha system. Obviously, this is something that humans are capable of, and in Bohm's telling, actually pulled it off, which is remarkable if you think about it, because in a way it means that the humans have culture in a way that chimpanzees don't. This is part of it. We create an egalitarian system and an egalitarian culture based upon a kind of deliberation or a decision about what's the best way to be. Now, that's probably way overreading what was actually going on in these people's heads at the time, but you can see that it's much more of a deliberative process in the control of the community. It's almost like Aristotelian politics, sitting down and making fundamental decisions about the regime for ourselves and for our society and all the rest of it. And of course, the human desire for honor is very different from earlier primate versions in that it can that we have abstract ideas, and that this sense of honor can attach itself to abstract ideals, such as liberty for all, or go Kansas State, or whatever it might happen to be. But of course, that then gets us into the problem that Fukuyama mentioned, and we are all very aware of, is that this honor can attach itself to perverse kinds of sense. The most scalps or the most people I can kill in a suicide bombing, and these are forms of honor. Okay, so all those problems are there, but I just want to finish with the big issue of, well, this is the reason why I was, although fascinated by evolution, I always avoided the subject, because political philosophy is sort of about, what is the best regime? There's different regimes out there. There are different cultures that that espouse different ideas. Our job is to figure out who is right, or at least to talk about who's right on the basis of that there is some rational way of sorting this out, or at least beginning to sort it out. Now, when evolutionists talk about morality, they're just social scientists. They're just saying, well, here's the way that humans happen to think. Here's the reflexes they happen to have when you push their buttons about honor or something like that. They can't say, here's the way that humans should react when you push their buttons about honor or something like that. And of course, that's our job. But how do you make an argument like that if you accept, the whole evolutionary account of who we are and where we came from? I mean, you can say we have this thumotic desire, and we can take it in an authoritarian direction, as we have through most of our history, or we can set up this liberal accommodation, and fine, but then evolution doesn't give you any way of saying one of those is better than the other, I don't think. Now, somebody like Aristotle obviously had no problem, but that's because he had this teleological view of nature. And as far as I know, evolution, it's incompatible with any teleological view, although many people have tried to resurrect teleology within Darwin. Liberalism just takes this fundamental impulse of preservation and interest and turns it into a moral thing. Everyone has a right to pursue their self-interest and so on, but in Darwinism, can any creature be said to have a right to what it desires? That seems equally hard to argue. So, I think there is this quandary. Evolution, I think, sheds some very interesting light on all the subjects that we deal with, human nature and how these regimes form, and what's the better or worse, or what are the limitations of each of these regimes. But then it seems to forestall any of the kind of moral conclusions or deliberations, that we like to get engaged in. So there is this argument, Tamler Summers makes, among others, that Darwinism is nihilism, get over it. And that's the conclusion that seems to be indicated, but I think there might be a way out. I've been looking for a way out, which is, if there is, maybe we can talk about a kind of human perfection or a human good that has a kind of moral weight as opposed to just being a biological fact or something like that. That is to say, we have some distinctively human traits. Rationality is the obvious one latched onto by Aristotle. We have, various forms of empathy and ability to deliberate in common and all these other kinds of things that no other species has. I think we can argue that this is somehow a moral good for human beings because of the specific character of those things. You become self-conscious, you are aware of things, you can really make your own choices, you can be autonomous in a meaningful way that no other creature can. And that somehow would be the basis of a kind of moral application, let's say. It comes out of human nature. Now, the difficulty or the peculiarity is that you can't really say that this came from nature. These marvelous qualities we have are really just products of blind chance. Nature was not intending to produce the most rational, self-conscious kind of creature, although, again, that's an argument some people try to make. It just happened. But maybe once that does happen, then that creature, kind of lives in a moral universe, actual moral universe, even though nature is not aware of it in some strange way and certainly did not plan it. And so it's natural in the sense that it comes from our nature, but it's not natural in the sense that it didn't come from, the cosmos in any way. So my hope is that, we can carve out some space in that way to prevent Darwinism from becoming nihilism. And then, of course, from then on, we are just involved in the same kind of controversies that have, once you start talking about human nature as a standard, then you get embroiled exactly in all these conversations about what part of human nature, what balance of different traits of human nature, all those kinds of things. And of course, in the matter of honor, you can then, in principle, distinguish, better and worse forms of honor, like the suicide bombing thing, that's wrong, and, the gentlemanly form, that's good. But then how do you go about shaping a culture to cater to those things, or discouraging one or the other? Now, since human beings are extremely adaptive to their cultural environment, there aren't many natural human norms, but once you are in a culture that has norms, there's this amazing human inclination to just glom onto those and regard them as sacred and everything else. So, changing the cultural environment is probably the best way to try to reform honor, but that's what Laurie Johnson and others have addressed, and I'm sure many of the papers today will address. That's not.